When you spend 40 years saving lives, they call you a hero. When you're over 60 and no longer needed, they call you a burden. My son said it calmly, without malice, almost gently with a note of concern in his voice. I think, Mom, it's time to start considering a retirement home. I looked at him in silence, at the boy I had raised alone, working double shifts in the ICU, at the man I had given all my savings to so he could open his own firm. He said it as if I had already expired, past my usefulness. I didn't yell, I didn't argue, I simply made one phone call. The next day he showed up with a box, thinking I'd start packing, but he was the one who walked away empty-handed. If this story resonated with your soul, click subscribe and let me know in the comments which city or country you're listening from. I'm truly curious to know where you're tuning in from. My name is Evelyn Marsh, and I was 67 years old when everything began to unravel. I had lived most of my life in Rochester, Minnesota, a town that breathed around the Mayo Clinic, the way old cities wrap themselves around cathedrals. For 42 years, I worked as a registered nurse in the intensive care unit there, walking the sterile corridors between life and death, between monitors that beeped like mechanical lullabies and hands that trembled at the edge of letting go. The ICU never scared me. The quiet did. Not the silence between patients or the hushed voices of worried families. No, the quiet that came after the machines stopped, the moment after the flatline. The room never felt emptier than when everything inside it had gone still. That was the kind of quiet I had grown used to. Not peaceful, not restful, but final. The quiet that knew things had changed and couldn't be undone. When I retired, they gave me a watch, a plaque, and a long round of applause at a staff luncheon catered by the same deli that had fueled most of our night shifts. I smiled for the photos. I hugged the nurses I had mentored. I said all the polite, graceful things one says when exiting a career they poured their soul into. And then I went home. For the first few weeks, I didn't know what to do with the space. My home was neat and quiet, the kind of place where every object had a purpose and a history. The armchair in the sunroom still held the shape of my late husband's back. The bookshelf was organized by subject, not color. My garden bloomed in rows. I tried to fill the days, morning tea, crosswords, afternoon walks along the Zumbro River. A bit of knitting, though I never had the patience for the intricate patterns. But the hours stretched. Even the light felt slower. I told myself I was lucky. I had my health, a pension, no debts, no drama. My son, Alex, lived in Chicago, running his law firm, busy with meetings and mergers and clients with last names that sounded like institutions. He called every week, sometimes twice. His voice always carried that clipped efficiency I'd come to recognize in men who believed kindness was best handled like a transaction, short, sweet, and on schedule. He visited every few months, brought wine I didn't drink and stories I didn't always follow. He smiled when he talked, but his eyes were always scanning the room like there was something more important just out of frame. I didn't blame him. Life had pulled us in different directions. I raised him on 12-hour shifts and microwave dinners, praying I'd make it home before he put himself to bed. I taught him independence because I had no other choice. I didn't expect him to linger. Still, the house felt too large some days, not because of its size, but because of the absence it amplified. I missed the urgency of the ICU, the sense that every breath mattered, that what I did had weight. At home, the only beeping came from the oven timer, and when the quiet came here, it didn't mean someone had died. It just meant no one was coming. Some evenings, I sat in the living room and let the TV play old medical dramas I couldn't take seriously. They never got the pacing right. No one ran blood cultures that fast. No one cried that often on a shift. But I watched them anyway, just to hear someone say, "Code Blue" again, even if it was fiction. My neighbors were kind. 2 widows down the street invited me to join a book club. I said yes, though I never finished the book. A woman from church stopped by with a casserole and asked if I wanted to join their volunteer team for hospital visits. I considered it. I even bought a new blouse for it. But I didn't go. I think I was waiting for something. I didn't know what. Not excitement, not romance. Something smaller, a nudge, a reason to turn the page. It was early spring when Alex called to say he'd be driving up for the weekend. His voice sounded unusually rehearsed, like he was reading from a script he didn't agree with. He asked if I needed anything. I told him no. He said he had some things to talk about. I said all right. We hung up, and the silence after the call felt different than usual. It lingered longer. It hummed. The night before he arrived, I cleaned the house more thoroughly than necessary. I washed the guest sheets even though I knew he wouldn't stay the night. I baked a chicken with rosemary and lemon, the way I used to when he was still in high school and had just come home from soccer practice with muddy cleats and endless hunger. I set the table for 2, laid out cloth napkins, lit a candle, then blew it out again. The house didn't need ambiance. It needed honesty. That night, as I folded a blanket over the couch, I thought about the ICU, about how we always prepped the room before a patient arrived. Fresh linens, clean monitors, a reset space. Not because it made the outcome better, but because it gave the illusion of control. And control, I had learned, was the first thing we all lost. Quietly. Without ceremony. I couldn't name the feeling I had in my chest. It wasn't dread. It wasn't hope. It was something in between. Something like standing at the edge of a closed door, hand on the knob, wondering what version of your life you'd find on the other side once it opened. I went to bed early that night, not because I was tired, but because I wasn't sure I wanted to hear what the morning might say. Alex arrived just after noon the next day. His car pulled into the driveway with its usual polished precision, black paint glinting under the overcast sky. He stepped out in a tailored coat and dress shoes, as if he had come directly from a meeting. He didn't carry a suitcase, just a leather messenger bag slung over one shoulder. I watched from the kitchen window as he looked up at the house, paused for a moment, and then headed toward the front door. There was no hesitation in his walk, just efficiency. I opened the door before he knocked. We exchanged a hug, brief, practiced, something closer to ritual than warmth. He smiled and said it was good to see me. I returned the gesture. I noticed the faint crease between his eyebrows, the way his eyes scanned the hallway behind me like he was already mentally walking through the conversation he'd come to have. We sat in the dining room. I had laid out the lunch I'd prepared: rosemary chicken, roasted carrots, soft rolls with honey butter. The plates were warm, the napkins folded neatly beside the silverware. He complimented the smell, served himself, and made a few comments about work, the city, traffic on I-90. I nodded, smiled, responded where appropriate. We moved around each other's words like dancers who had memorized the steps long ago. We ate in relative silence, the kind that fills a room not with tension but with distance. I could tell he was waiting, measuring the moment, choosing the timing. I didn't push. I let him find it. When he finally set down his fork and pushed the plate back slightly, I knew the turn had come. He began slowly, thanking me for the meal, complimenting how well I seemed to be managing the house. He used words like independent and strong, words that came laced with something else underneath. He said he'd been thinking a lot about my future, about my well-being, about how important it was to plan things now before they became emergencies, before we were forced to make decisions reactively. I listened, I waited. Then he said it. It's time we looked at other options for you, long-term options, somewhere with support, a facility. He said it gently, kindly even, as if the softness of the tone would blunt the shape of the words, as if by dressing the thought in clinical language, it wouldn't land like a dismissal. He mentioned names, a few places in Rochester, one just outside of St. Paul, all highly rated with wonderful reviews and personalized care. He spoke like someone who had rehearsed the pitch, not once, but over and over again. Probably in his head during long drives or in the quiet moments between court filings. It wasn't spontaneous. This was a conclusion he had reached, not a conversation he had come to have. I didn't interrupt him. I let him finish. He didn't ask what I wanted. He didn't ask how I felt. He simply presented the idea as logical, inevitable, even kind. He framed it as love, as protection, as the responsible thing. But all I heard was the quiet undercurrent of displacement, the implication that my usefulness had expired, that my space in his life had become a liability, that I, who had held his fevered body through 100 childhood nights and worked double shifts to afford his tuition, now needed to be managed. When he finished, he looked at me expectantly, waiting, I suppose, for understanding, for gratitude, for some graceful acceptance that would make the entire moment easier to digest. Instead, I smiled, not out of agreement, but because I had finally heard him clearly. He hadn't come to check on me. He had come to move me off the board. He thought he was being proactive, thought he was protecting me from decline, from risk, from loneliness, but really, he was protecting himself. From guilt, from inconvenience, from the awkwardness of watching age bloom in the corners of his life. I stood up and began clearing the table. He offered to help. I told him I had it handled. He lingered for a few more minutes, walking through the living room, commenting on the photos that hadn't changed since his last visit. I watched him from the kitchen doorway. He looked like a man taking inventory, not of a home, but of a chapter he was ready to close. When he left, he hugged me again, a little tighter, as if that would soften the edges of what he'd said. He promised to send me links to the facilities. I nodded and waved as he backed out of the driveway. The house was quiet again, but the quiet was different now. It wasn't peaceful. It was hollow. That night, I didn't sleep. I sat in the armchair by the window, my hands folded in my lap, the television off. Outside, the wind rustled the bare branches of the maple tree. The streetlights glowed faintly against the fog. I thought about the hundreds of families I'd cared for in the ICU. Sons and daughters who clutched their parents' hands and wept with regret, with love, with grief. And I wondered when exactly that love begins to turn into management, when care becomes control, when children stop looking at you and start looking past you. I sat there until the light shifted gray again, and then I rose, walked to the hallway closet, and pulled out the lockbox where I kept my estate documents. It was time for my own decision. I sat at the kitchen table for a long time with the lockbox in front of me, untouched. The metal felt cold even through the cotton of my sleeve. It had been years since I last opened it. Years since I'd even thought about what was inside. A lifetime of paper and signatures and intentions locked away beneath a simple silver clasp. I turned the key slowly, as if unlocking it might release something irreversible. In truth, it already had. Inside were the pieces of my past, stacked neatly in manila folders labeled in my handwriting. Insurance policies, bank records, power of attorney, a list of contacts, most of them crossed out over the years. And there, on top, the folder marked Will, capital letters, confident strokes, a document that had once meant clarity, fairness, love. The last time I had revised it was in 2016. I had listed Alex as my sole beneficiary, my home, my accounts, my personal items, all of it earmarked with the assumption that he would care, that he would know what those things had meant, that he would honor not just the assets, but the life that built them. Back then, it felt like the obvious thing to do. He was my only child. There was no one else. But now, as I unfolded the document and smoothed the pages across the table, the words felt different. Not wrong, but outdated, misaligned, like a story that no longer fit the ending it was leading to. I read each section slowly. My name, Evelyn Marsh, written in full. The property address. The detailed allocation of every possession, from my retirement savings to the box of family heirlooms stored in the attic. All of it, page after page, offered up to someone who had just tried to gently erase me from his future. I felt a tightness in my chest, but it wasn't sadness. It was clarity. I closed the folder and reached for my laptop. The screen glowed in the dim light of the kitchen. My fingers hovered over the keyboard, hesitant only for a breath, then began to move with purpose. I searched for my attorney. Her name was Judith Bradley. We'd met years ago when she came into the ER after collapsing from exhaustion during a trial. She'd been dehydrated, dizzy, embarrassed. I had brought her a blanket and a cold apple juice, and she never forgot. Later that year, she helped me write the first version of my will. I wasn't sure if she still practiced, but I found her name easily. Same office, same photo on the website. I emailed her at once, kept the message brief, but direct. I told her I needed to amend my estate plan and that it was time-sensitive. I hit send and exhaled slowly. The cursor blinked back at me, patient as always. She called the next morning, her voice as warm and precise as I remembered. She said she had time that afternoon and offered to come to me. I agreed. When she arrived, she didn't ask questions. She set her bag on the table, took out her notepad and recorder, and listened. I told her everything, not emotionally, not bitterly, just plainly. I explained what Alex had said, how he had said it, and how it made me feel. I told her I had spent my life serving others and had planned to leave everything to my son, not because he needed it, but because I thought he saw me. I told her I no longer believed that. Judith didn't blink. She nodded, flipped to a fresh page, and began drafting. We spent over an hour reviewing every clause. I revoked the previous will in full. The new document removed Alex as the primary beneficiary. Instead, I designated my assets to be divided among 3 recipients: a scholarship fund for aspiring nurses in rural communities, a hospice care training program in partnership with Mayo Clinic, and a modest trust to be managed by a local nonprofit that provided free home care visits to low-income elders. Judith raised an eyebrow only once, when I requested a specific clause stating that under no circumstance could Alex appeal the will on grounds of mental incompetence or undue influence. I told her to write it as strongly as the law allowed. She did. She asked if I wanted to leave him anything at all. A token, a letter, even just a photograph. I thought about it for a long time. Then I said no. He had made his statement. This was mine. Once everything was drafted, she printed a temporary copy for review and scheduled a formal signing when 2 witnesses the following week. She told me I was resolute. I told her I had spent my whole life following orders in a hospital where lives were measured in charts and lab results. Making decisions didn't scare me. Being erased quietly, that did. After she left, I sat alone with the folder again, this time with a new label. Updated Will 2024. I placed it back in the lockbox, closed it, and turned the key with finality. That evening, I walked out to the backyard. The sun was beginning to set, casting the yard in amber light. I sat on the garden bench Harold built years before he died. The wood had faded, but it was sturdy. I thought about how many things in life survive, even when they're no longer tended to daily. Some things endure simply because they were built well from the start. I had spent decades being useful, necessary, trusted. In a hospital, you learn to read silence better than any spoken word. You learn to see what people don't say. I saw my son's words more clearly now than ever before. Not just the ones he said aloud, but the ones between the lines. He thought I was a chapter to close, but I wasn't done writing, and now the ending would be mine. It was a Thursday afternoon when Alex showed up again. I wasn't expecting him. I had just returned from the grocery store and was still unpacking canned goods and oatmeal when I heard the doorbell. I looked through the peephole and saw him standing there, wearing a dark jacket, his expression unreadable. In his hands was a cardboard box, not large, but full enough to need both arms. I opened the door, and he gave me a strained smile, the kind that tries to pass as casual but carries too much weight behind it. He stepped inside without waiting for an invitation. I noticed the way he looked around the house, as if mentally cataloging what would need to be moved, what could be sold or stored. His eyes passed over the framed photos on the shelf, the crocheted throw on the armchair, the porcelain teapot on the kitchen counter. It was the look of someone preparing for transition. Not mourning, not reminiscing, just sorting. He set the box down in the entryway. I didn't ask what was in it. I didn't need to. He started talking about a facility again, this time with more certainty, like he'd already made the arrangements. He said he'd spoken to someone at a place called Clearwood Estates, a highly rated senior living community with on-site medical staff and full amenities. He used phrases like peace of mind and predictable care. He talked about scheduled meals and wellness checks and a beautiful garden courtyard. I let him speak, his words bouncing off the walls like sales pitches in a room where no one was buying. Then he gestured to the box, said it was just for the essentials, clothes, toiletries, a few personal items. He said we could handle the rest later, once I was settled in. He called it a soft move. I stood there, watching him, his face calm, his posture confident. He thought he was being compassionate, practical. He thought he was stepping up, but all I saw was someone who had decided I didn't belong in my own life anymore. I didn't argue. I didn't raise my voice. I simply walked into the other room and returned with a white envelope. Inside was a single sheet of paper neatly folded, my signature at the bottom in blue ink, the revised copy of my will. I handed it to him. He took it with a puzzled expression, then unfolded it. His eyes scanned the page. They moved quickly at first, then slowed. He reread certain lines. I watched his jaw tighten, the corners of his mouth pull inward. When he reached the final paragraph, he looked up at me. For the first time in a long time, he was silent. He didn't ask questions. He didn't make excuses. He just stood there, holding the paper like it had scorched his hands. I picked up the box he had brought and carried it back to the front door. It was heavier than I expected. I placed it gently on the porch. He watched me do it, but said nothing. I turned back to him and waited. He hesitated for a second, then followed. He stepped outside, not with anger, not with defeat, just with the fragile, stunned confusion of someone who had misread the rules of the game. I closed the door behind him. I didn't slam it. I didn't need to. The click of the lock was enough. Back inside, the house was quiet again. But this time, it felt different. Not hollow, not anxious, just still, like something had been lifted or exhaled. I returned to the kitchen and continued unpacking the groceries. Each can clinked softly as I placed it on the shelf. I brewed a cup of tea and carried it to the armchair in the sunroom. The sunlight had shifted across the floor, long and golden now, stretching over the rug like a warm invitation. I sat down and wrapped the throw around my shoulders. Outside, his car started. I didn't get up to watch him drive away. I didn't need to see it. The box was gone, and so was the illusion that I owed anyone my surrender. The next morning arrived with a gray stillness that clung to the windows and softened the outlines of the trees outside. I moved through my morning routine slowly, as if my body was adjusting to a different kind of gravity. There was no rush, no checklist to follow. The house was silent, save for the faint hum of the refrigerator and the kettle beginning to steam. I stood in the kitchen watching the steam rise from my tea and wondered what Alex was feeling at that very moment. The night before had ended without drama. No shouting, no pleas, just the soft closing of the door and the distant sound of tires crunching gravel. It was the quietest confrontation I'd ever had, and perhaps the most effective, because sometimes silence carries a finality that no raised voice can match. I had expected a reaction, maybe not right away, but eventually. It came around noon. The phone rang. His name lit up on the screen. I let it ring 4 times before answering. I wanted to make space for him to think before speaking. When I finally picked up, there was a long pause on his end, like he wasn't sure which version of me would greet him. His voice was different, no longer firm and composed, but thinner, almost tentative. He asked if I had meant what the document said. He sounded like someone who had just discovered a hidden clause in a contract he thought he had written himself. I told him I had reviewed everything carefully with my attorney, that it was legal, notarized, witnessed, and complete. He was quiet again. Then came the shock in his voice. Not anger, not even disappointment, just disbelief. As if the very idea that his inheritance was not guaranteed had never once occurred to him. He asked why I hadn't told him I felt this way. I told him I had, in ways he didn't notice, through the dinners he missed, the visits he shortened, the conversations he steered away from anything deeper than logistics, through the way he planned my future like I was a project, not a person. There was no apology, only silence. And then, finally, he said he didn't think I would go through with it. That was the part that stayed with me, the disbelief, not because he didn't think I could, but because he didn't think I would. He had underestimated me, not just as a woman, not just as a mother, but as a person, someone with boundaries, with limits, with the quiet strength to draw a line and hold it. After the call ended, I sat in the sunroom with the phone resting on the table beside me. The sky outside had begun to shift from flat gray to a warmer silver, as if light was trying to break through. I thought about all the years I had spent believing that love meant giving everything. That sacrifice was just part of the job. That mothers were supposed to be grateful for whatever space they were allowed to keep. But I was no longer in the business of shrinking myself. That afternoon, I received 2 more calls. One from Alex's law partner, a woman named Denise, whom I had only met once at a holiday party years ago. Her voice was professional but edged with curiosity. She said Alex had been a little shaken and that he was trying to process things. I told her this was not a legal discussion and that my documents were not up for review by anyone outside my counsel. The second call came from an unknown number, a voice I didn't recognize, his ex-wife, Melissa. We hadn't spoken since the divorce, and even then our relationship had been polite at best. She surprised me. She said she understood, that she had seen the same patterns, that maybe now he'd start listening. That evening, I cooked a simple dinner, baked salmon, green beans, a small salad. I ate at the kitchen table with the radio playing softly in the background. No news, just music. Jazz, I think. Something without lyrics. Afterward, I sat in the living room with a cup of tea and watched the light fade. The house felt full, not with people, but with peace. There was no tension pressed against the walls, no expectation hovering in the corners. Just me, in my space, with the dignity I had reclaimed. That night, as I got ready for bed, I opened the small wooden box on my nightstand. Inside were a few old letters, a faded photo of Harold, and a list I had written on a yellow notepad years ago. At the top of the list, in capital letters, I had written, "What I want to leave behind." I had meant it metaphorically at the time. Memories, stories, lessons. But now I knew it was more than that. It wasn't about what I left behind. It was about what I chose to carry forward and what I refused to be erased from. It began as a ripple, a message here, a voicemail there. Quiet at first, like the tide pulling back from the shore, but I could feel it building. The wave didn't crash all at once. It crept. And then, without warning, it broke. The first call came from a woman named Sandra, someone I vaguely remembered from a charity luncheon Alex had brought me to years ago. She sounded awkward, overly cheerful. She said she'd recently spoken with Alex and had heard that I was making some big changes. She used that phrase, big changes, like she was commenting on new wallpaper or a haircut gone wrong. I could hear it in her voice, the way she probed gently, trying to coax out some version of the story she hadn't been told. I gave her nothing. I thanked her for calling and hung up before she could begin her pitch for sympathy. Then came the texts. Cousins I hadn't seen in years, former colleagues, one of Alex's college friends who somehow still had my number. They weren't hostile, just curious. They asked how I was, asked if I was okay. One or two offered generic platitudes about family being complicated. Most simply wanted to know what had happened, as if a shift in a will was enough to send tremors through an entire web of acquaintances. The real storm, though, came from Alex. He left 3 voicemails in one day, each one more frantic than the last. In the first, he was calm, trying to reframe the issue as a misunderstanding. In the second, he was more defensive, talking about how hard he'd worked, how much stress he was under. By the third, his voice had cracked. He wasn't yelling, but there was panic there. Panic layered with disbelief, like a man watching a structure fall that he never thought could collapse. He said he didn't understand why I would do this to him. That phrase echoed, why I would do this to him, as if standing up for myself was an act of aggression, as if reasserting control over my own life and legacy was a betrayal. I listened to each message once, then deleted them. I didn't respond. There was nothing to clarify. Later that week, I received a formal letter from his attorney. Not a lawsuit, just a letter. Language full of suggestion, veiled concern, terms like capacity and intent. Judith reviewed it and laughed under her breath. She told me not to worry. She said it was bluster, nothing more. A man trying to reestablish control through channels he understood. But what surprised me most wasn't the noise. It was the reaction from people I hadn't expected. A nurse I had trained 2 decades ago wrote me an email after seeing a community bulletin mentioning my name tied to a new nursing scholarship. She thanked me, said she was one of those kids who never thought she'd make it through school, said she still remembered the way I taught her to center a catheter without flinching or apologizing. She told me that what I was doing, redirecting my estate toward people who would carry the work forward, meant something. Another message came from a woman I didn't know. She said her mother had been in my care during her final days in the ICU years earlier. She said she still remembered the sound of my voice reading psalms at her mother's bedside, long after visiting hours had ended. She said she'd never forgotten that kindness. I sat with those words for a long time. They washed over me gently, in contrast to the wave Alex had tried to send. There's a difference between noise and meaning, between those who reach out to change your mind and those who simply thank you for who you are. The pressure from Alex continued for a while, a voicemail every few days, a text here and there. Some came wrapped in guilt, others in nostalgia. A few even held hints of sincerity. I believed in his own way he was struggling, not just with the loss of an inheritance, but with the revelation that I wasn't who he thought I was, or perhaps that I no longer fit the version of me he had created for his own convenience. He wanted his mother to be gentle, generous, predictable. But I had been all of those things already. Now I was something else. I was resolved. One evening, near the end of March, I took a long walk along Silver Lake. The ice had just started to thaw, and the water moved slowly under the surface, heavy with winter's memory. I sat on a bench near the water and watched a pair of ducks glide across the open patch in the center. The sky was soft, painted in muted purples and peach. I thought about legacy, about what we owe our children and what we don't, about the weight of blood versus the weight of truth. I thought about how we inherit not just money or property, but patterns, expectations, silences. I was done with silence. I was done with inheritance as an obligation. The wave had come, and I was still standing, not just because I had prepared for it, but because I had finally remembered that the shore was mine. It didn't happen all at once, but slowly, steadily, like fog lifting after a long night. The noise began to fade. The voicemails slowed to one every few days, then once a week. The texts became shorter, more tentative, until they stopped altogether. No more calls from his law firm. No more distant friends asking cautious questions. No more whispers of concern disguised as curiosity. There was only quiet. But this quiet was different. It didn't hum with tension or waiting. It didn't carry the weight of unsaid things. It was deeper, fuller. It settled over the house like a blanket that had finally been folded just right. It was the kind of silence that asked nothing of me. I began waking with the sun again. Not because I needed to, but because I wanted to. I would make tea and sit on the back porch, wrapped in a shawl, watching the light stretch itself slowly across the grass. There were birds that returned each morning, small, brown, busy little things that chirped like they were late for something. I watched them, sipped my tea, and let the warmth spread through my chest. The house began to feel like mine again. I rearranged the furniture, not drastically, just enough to feel a shift. I moved the armchair closer to the window. I took down a few photos, put up others, ones I had kept in drawers for years. A younger version of myself, standing in scrubs, grinning in front of the Mayo Clinic with 3 fellow nurses. A picture of Harold, blurry and sun-drenched, holding a fishing rod and wearing the ugliest hat I'd ever seen. A candid of me and Alex when he was 5, both of us covered in flour from a baking experiment that had gone sideways. I didn't hang it to forgive him. I hung it because it reminded me that once, long ago, we had known how to laugh together. I started writing again. Not anything formal, just notes, observations, small stories from the ICU I'd never shared, not because they were secrets, but because I never had the space for them. I bought a stack of legal pads and a fresh pack of pens and let the thoughts come as they pleased. Some days I wrote for hours, others just a few lines. I didn't edit, I didn't reread, I let the act be enough. I also began spending more time in the community. I joined a mentorship program for retired medical professionals and was paired with a young woman named Talia, a second-year nursing student from a small town in northern Minnesota. She reminded me of myself, serious, determined, hungry for something more. We met once a week at a cafe near the university. She asked questions, took notes, listened with the kind of focus that only comes from those who've seen the inside of fear and still choose to show up anyway. Guiding her felt like planting something in soil I hadn't touched in years. I found joy in small things again. The smell of cinnamon toast, a letter from an old friend in Georgia, a neighbor's toddler waving at me from their porch swing. I knit a new blanket for the guest room, not because anyone was coming to stay, but because my hands wanted to create something that could hold warmth. I didn't forget what had happened. I didn't pretend Alex hadn't tried to move me out of my own life like an expired fixture, but I no longer carried it like a wound. It had become a scar instead, a line in the map of who I was now. Every now and then I thought about calling him, just once, just to say something simple, but I never did. Not because I was angry, but because the space between us needed to stay quiet a little longer, maybe forever. I had made my decision, and the stillness that followed it had brought me something I hadn't realized I was missing. Peace. Not the kind people describe in greeting cards, not the soft, focused pastel version, but the real kind, the hard-earned, quietly fierce kind that comes when you reclaim your place, when you remember that you are not a burden. You are a person with a story and a spine. The calm didn't arrive with fanfare. It didn't announce itself. It just came. And when it did, I was ready. It was a quiet April morning when I realized I'd found my way home. Not to a place, but to something deeper, something steadier. The spring air drifted through the open windows, carrying the scent of damp soil and blooming daffodils. The light had softened in a way that only happens after a hard season passes, as if the world itself was beginning to exhale. I had started the day like I did most now, slowly, with care. Tea in my favorite mug, a slice of buttered toast, the soft creak of the floorboards beneath my feet. The sunroom had become my sanctuary. The chair I once thought of as temporary now bore the shape of my rest. I kept a woven basket by my side filled with yarn and unfinished knitting projects. Some would never be finished. That didn't bother me. The purpose was in the doing, not the completing. That morning, I walked through each room of my house, not looking for anything in particular, but simply feeling its presence. The way the afternoon light collected on the bookshelves, the faint creak in the hallway near the bathroom, the way the stairs groaned exactly halfway up, no matter how gently you stepped. These were the things that made a home. Not furniture or photographs, but memory embedded in wood and silence. I stopped in the guest room. The bed was neatly made, the air faintly scented with lavender from the sachets I had tucked into the drawers. On the nightstand sat a small framed photo of my parents on their wedding day, next to a stack of nursing textbooks I kept for nostalgia more than utility. I thought about who might sleep here one day, a friend passing through, maybe Talia, my mentee, during a storm, maybe no one, and that too would be fine. Home wasn't a place I needed to fill with people to prove it was worth keeping. It was mine, whether anyone visited or not. Later that afternoon, I sat on the porch with a book I had read 3 times already. I wasn't really reading it again. I just liked the feel of the pages in my hands. The wind picked up gently, brushing against the wind chimes that hung from the awning. Their notes were soft, uneven, like distant bells echoing through memory. A robin landed on the fence and looked at me for a long moment before flying off. I watched it go, a flicker of red and brown against the pale blue sky. I thought about Harold then, not with sorrow, but with warmth. The way he used to sing off-key while mowing the lawn. The way he'd make me laugh during the most stressful days. The way he never questioned my strength, even when I did. I wondered what he'd say about everything that had happened. About Alex, about the will, about the way I had chosen to live the final chapters of my life on my own terms. I imagined him nodding, maybe smiling, maybe just sitting beside me without saying a word, which was always his quiet way of saying everything. In the evening, I opened the closet in the hallway and pulled down the old cedar chest. Inside were things I hadn't touched in years. Letters, baby shoes, a tiny sweater I had knit before Alex was born. I held it in my hands and studied the seams, the uneven stitches, the loose end I had never tucked in. It had been his once. I had made it with care and expectation and love. I placed it back in the chest and closed the lid. That night, I received a letter in the mail. No return address, but I knew the handwriting. It was shaky, uneven. Alex. Inside was a single sheet of paper. He didn't ask for forgiveness. He didn't try to explain. He just said he'd been wrong, that he had been afraid, that he hoped I was well. No promises, no requests. It was the first honest thing he'd sent in years. I folded the letter and placed it in a drawer. I didn't feel the need to reply. Not yet. Maybe not ever. Some things don't need to be answered. They just need to be acknowledged. Before bed, I walked through the house one last time, turning off lights, checking the doors. The house didn't feel like a shelter anymore. It felt like an extension of me. I had built a life within these walls that didn't require validation or permission. As I pulled back the covers and climbed into bed, I looked around the room. The lamp cast a soft glow on the walls. The window was cracked open just enough to let in the night air. In the distance, an owl called out once, then again, before disappearing into the dark. I closed my eyes and let the stillness settle. This was my home, not because of what it contained, but because of what I no longer had to carry inside it. And for the first time in a long time, I didn't feel like I was waiting for anything. I was exactly where I was meant to be,